Somewhere in the southern Nevada desert, about 83 miles northwest of Las Vegas, there is a place that doesn't officially exist. It has no address you can type into Google Maps and actually reach. The roads leading to it are unmarked, and the ones that are marked end in signs that say things like use of deadly force authorized. Camouflaged trucks follow you if you get too close. Sensors buried in the dirt track your footsteps. And if you pull out a camera and point it in the wrong direction, men in vehicles with no license plates will appear as if they materialize from the desert itself. And yet, somehow, millions of people know exactly where it is. The place is called Area 51. And tonight, you're going to hear everything. Now, before you start thinking this is going to be 2 hours of tinfoil hats and alien autopsies, let me stop you right there. Because the real story of Area 51 is stranger, more complicated, and in many ways more unsettling than any single theory could capture. What happened out there in that Nevada basin, in that flat stretch of earth beside a dry lake bed called Groom Lake, is a story that starts with genuine, documented, declassified military history. Spy planes that flew higher than anything else on Earth. Aircraft so advanced that the engineers who built them weren't sure physics would cooperate. Programs so secret that the United States government preferred to let its own citizens believe they were seeing alien spacecraft rather than admit what was actually being tested. That part is confirmed. That part is real. That part alone is extraordinary enough to keep you awake. But then the story keeps going. Because after the official history, there are the testimonies. Witnesses, former employees, people who worked inside that base and came out saying they saw things they couldn't explain with the vocabulary of conventional engineering. Some of them gave names, gave dates, gave technical descriptions. Some of them lost their health, their careers, their credibility. And some of them, frankly, have never been fully debunked. So here's how tonight is going to work. We're going to travel through the entire history of this place together. We'll start from the very beginning, before the base even existed, when that stretch of Nevada desert was nothing but heat and silence and the occasional nuclear test cloud drifting over from somewhere nearby. We'll move through the Cold War urgency that created the base in the first place, the secret aircraft programs that defined it, the accidents that happened inside its borders that the government couldn't acknowledge, and the slow leak of information that eventually made the public realize that something enormous had been happening out there for decades. We'll talk about what's been confirmed, we'll talk about what's been suggested, and we'll sit with what remains genuinely, stubbornly unknown. Because here's the thing about Area 51 that I want you to hold on to as you drift through this story tonight. The fact that the government lied about this place for so long, consistently and aggressively, is not in question. That's documented. They lied about its existence. They lied about what flew there. They pressured witnesses. They classified information that affected the health of workers who had no idea what they were being exposed to. When an institution has that track record, demanding hard proof before entertaining any unusual claim starts to feel a little naive. So tonight we're keeping an open mind, not a credulous one, not one that accepts everything without scrutiny, but an honest one. One that looks at the documented history and the witness accounts and the rumors and the strange radar returns and the lights in the sky and says, here's what we know, here's what people have said, and here's what we simply cannot explain yet. You don't have to believe in anything tonight, you just have to listen. The desert has a way of absorbing secrets. Sand doesn't talk. Mountains don't file reports. And when your nearest neighbor is 100 miles away across cracked earth and Joshua trees, you can do just about anything you want without anyone ever really knowing. For decades, that's exactly what happened out there. So get comfortable. Let the tension drain out of your shoulders. Close your eyes if you want. This story will carry you. From the Cold War to the cover-ups, from the test pilots who pushed aircraft past the edge of the possible, to the questions that still don't have clean answers sitting at the bottom of this long desert night. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning. And the beginning starts with a war, a rivalry, and a sky that someone desperately needed to own. Before there was a base, there was just the land. And the land itself tells a story that goes back a lot further than the Cold War. The Great Basin Desert in southern Nevada is one of the more unforgiving places on the continent. It sits at high elevation, ringed by mountain ranges that trap what little moisture drifts in from the coast and wring it dry before it ever reaches the valley floors. The average annual rainfall in the region is measured in single-digit inches. Summer temperatures push past 110 degrees. Winter nights drop below freezing. The ground is a mix of pale caliche, cracked silt, and alkaline dust that coats everything it touches. It is, by most definitions, a place designed to discourage human presence. And yet people have lived there for thousands of years. The Western Shoshone people inhabited this region long before any government claimed it. They knew the desert not as an obstacle but as a home, moving seasonally through its mountain ranges and dry valleys, following game, harvesting pine nuts, reading the landscape with the kind of deep knowledge that takes generations to accumulate. The Groom Lake Basin itself, that wide flat expanse of dry alkaline lakebed that would one day become the most secretive military installation on Earth, was part of their territory. The land held meaning before it held classified projects. That context tends to get skipped over in most histories of the base, but it's worth letting sit for a moment. The story of Area 51 is built on top of a much older story. The desert was never empty. It was never waiting to be discovered. It was already someone's home. By the mid-1800s, silver and gold brought prospectors into the region, and small mining operations dotted the ranges surrounding what would become Groom Lake. The Groom mine itself operated in the hills just north of the dry lakebed, pulling lead and silver ore out of the rock for decades. The area was remote, difficult to reach, and economically marginal, which meant it stayed largely undeveloped well into the 20th century. A handful of ranches, a few dirt roads, a landscape that the rest of the country mostly forgot existed. Then the war came, and the government started paying attention to Nevada in a different way. During World War II, the military began establishing training ranges and bombing practice sites across the Nevada desert. The isolation that made the region economically useless made it tactically perfect. You could test things out there, loud things, destructive things, things that left craters. The Las Vegas Army Airfield, which would eventually become Nellis Air Force Base, opened in 1941 and became one of the largest gunnery and bombardment training centers in the country. The surrounding desert was essentially converted into a practice range the size of a small European country. After the war ended, the infrastructure stayed, and then the Cold War started, and the government's appetite for remote Nevada real estate grew considerably. In 1951, the Atomic Energy Commission established the Nevada test site about 65 miles south of Groom Lake. What followed was one of the most surreal chapters in American history. Atmospheric nuclear test detonated within driving distance of Las Vegas. Hotel guests watched mushroom clouds from casino rooftops. Tourists drove out to elevated spots to see the flashes. The government told everyone it was safe. The downwinders, the people who lived in small towns in Nevada and Utah, directly in the path of radioactive fallout, were told it was safe. We know now that it was not, but that reckoning came slowly, bitterly, and decades too late. The point is that by the early 1950s, the Nevada desert had already been woven into the fabric of the American national security state. It was a place where the rules were different, where things happened that the public wasn't told about, where geography provided cover that no security fence could replicate. Groom Lake sat at the northern end of this expanding web of military real estate. It was already adjacent to restricted airspace associated with the Nevada test site. The dry lakebed itself was flat, hard, and enormous, essentially a natural runway stretching for miles with no obstructions in any direction. The surrounding mountains and valleys created natural barriers that made ground approach difficult and visual surveillance from outside nearly impossible. The nearest paved road was far enough away to make accidental discovery unlikely. The nearest community was further still. When the people who were about to build one of the most secret aircraft programs in history started looking for a place to do it, Groom Lake was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice made by people who understood exactly what they needed. Isolation, infrastructure nearby but not too close, restricted airspace they could expand, and a geography that would swallow secrets the way the alkaline soil swallowed rain. Whatever was about to happen out there, the land had been quietly preparing for it for a long time. The land was ready. What took longer to arrive was the specific crisis that would put it to use. By 1950, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked into something that didn't have a name yet, but everyone could feel. It wasn't quite a war. It was something more like a permanent state of armed tension, a standoff between two systems of government, two visions of the future, and two expanding arsenals of weapons capable of ending civilization. The phrase Cold War got used more and more because it captured something real. The temperature was always just below the point of ignition, and everyone knew that if it crossed that line, the next conflict wouldn't look anything like the last one. The Soviets detonated their first nuclear device in 1949, 4 years ahead of American intelligence estimates. That single event reshuffled everything. The US had been operating on the assumption that it had time, that the technological gap was wide enough to provide some margin of safety. That assumption evaporated in the desert of Kazakhstan in August of 1949, and what replaced it was something closer to dread. If they had the bomb, they might have the delivery systems. If they had delivery systems, they could reach American cities. And if they could reach American cities and the US didn't know it was coming, there would be no second chance to respond. This is where the crisis of intelligence begins. The United States knew almost nothing about what was actually happening inside the Soviet Union. The USSR was a closed society on a scale that's difficult to fully appreciate now. No free press, heavily controlled borders, visitors were shepherded and monitored. Diplomats operated under surveillance. Human intelligence networks were being systematically rolled up by Soviet counterintelligence. The CIA was getting fragments, rumors, secondhand assessments, and not much else. They didn't know where Soviet bomber bases were. They didn't know how many aircraft were being produced. They didn't know the status of the nuclear program beyond the fact that it existed. They were essentially navigating a geopolitical crisis in total darkness. And then in 1953, Stalin died. There was a brief, careful optimism about whether things might ease. They didn't, really. The new Soviet leadership maintained the military buildup. And in 1955, the Soviets revealed something at an air show that sent American analysts into a quiet panic. They flew a large number of their new long-range bomber, the Bison, in formation overhead. What the American observers didn't know immediately was that the Soviets had flown the same small group of aircraft in repeated passes to create the impression of a much larger fleet. It worked. American intelligence reported a massive Soviet bomber buildup. The so-called bomber gap became a political crisis, a budget crisis, a national security crisis, and the whole thing was theater, a carefully staged piece of strategic deception that the US had no way to see through because it had no way to see inside Soviet airspace at all. Something had to change. The United States needed eyes over the Soviet Union, and it needed them badly. The options were limited, and most of them were bad. Sending conventional aircraft into Soviet airspace was essentially a declaration of hostile intent. The Soviets had air defenses. They had jet interceptors. Any reconnaissance plane flying at normal altitudes would be detected, intercepted, and very probably shot down, triggering an international incident that nobody wanted, and providing the Soviets with a public relations gift they absolutely did not deserve. Satellites capable of imaging the Soviet Union didn't exist yet. The technology was years away from operational readiness. What was needed was an aircraft that could fly higher than any Soviet interceptor could reach. An aircraft so far above the ceiling of conventional flight that radar operators might not even believe what they were seeing. An aircraft that could cross the Soviet Union from one end to the other, photograph everything below it in extraordinary detail, and return home before anyone could do anything about it. In 1954, the CIA under Director Allen Dulles began seriously pushing for exactly this kind of program. The man who took operational control of the project was Richard Bissell, a Yale-educated economist who had no aviation background, but possessed an unusual combination of intellectual firepower, administrative drive, and a willingness to operate outside normal bureaucratic channels. Bissell was the kind of person who made things happen by refusing to accept the standard explanation for why they couldn't. He would go on to become one of the most consequential figures in the secret history of American intelligence, though his legacy is complicated by what came after. He ran the U-2 program first, and then he ran the Bay of Pigs, which did not go as smoothly. But in the mid-1950s, he was the engine driving an aircraft program that most of Washington didn't know existed. The aircraft itself would come from a small, deliberately obscure division of the Lockheed Corporation based in Burbank, California. The Skunk Works, Officially, the Advanced Development Projects Division had earned its reputation during World War II by producing the P-80, America's first operational jet fighter, in a development time that would be considered impossible today. The man who ran it was Clarence Leonard Johnson, known universally as Kelly. He was blunt to the point of being almost aggressive, intolerant of bureaucratic delay, and possessed of an engineering intuition that bordered on the uncanny. Kelly Johnson's standard was performance above everything. If a design wasn't right, it didn't matter how many committees had approved it. If a timeline was slipping, the answer was more work, not more meetings. He built a team and a culture that operated like nothing else in the American defense industry, and the aircraft they were about to design would prove it. In early 1955, with a contract essentially agreed upon between the CIA, the Air Force, and Lockheed, the Skunk Works team needed a place to build and test their new machine far from curious eyes. The aircraft would require long runways. It would require complete secrecy. It would require space to operate without any possibility of commercial or civilian observation. Kelly Johnson and the program's leadership turned to the question of where such a place could possibly exist. The survey that followed was methodical. They needed remoteness, but not inaccessibility. They needed existing restricted airspace. They needed a surface suitable for an aircraft with unusual performance characteristics. They needed somewhere that could be built up quickly and quietly. In April of 1955, Kelly Johnson and CIA officer Richard Bissell flew over a dry lake bed in southern Nevada. From the air, it was exactly what the program needed. Long, flat, hard, hidden by surrounding mountains, already adjacent to restricted government land associated with the Nevada test site. It was, in Johnson's assessment, the best spot in the world. The place was called Groom Lake, and within months it would stop being a dot on a map that nobody looked at and start becoming something the government would spend the next several decades pretending didn't exist. Construction started the way a lot of secret things in American history start, with a handful of people, a vague cover story, and a lot of overtime. In mid-1955, Groom Lake was still just alkaline dust and silence. There were no hangars, no barracks, no fuel farms, no radar towers. Just a wide, pale oval of hard-packed lakebed and ringed mountains that made the horizon feel close and watchful. The orders that went out were straightforward on paper and insane in practice. Build an airbase in the middle of nowhere from scratch in a matter of months, and do it so quietly that almost no one outside a tiny circle in Washington and Burbank had any idea what was happening. Crews came in under mundane designations. On paper, this was just another remote test annex for the Atomic Energy Commission and the Air Force, part of the larger Nevada test site ecosystem. In reality, it was a crash program. Graders carved a long, narrow strip into the lakebed itself, pressing it into a primitive runway more than enough for the skinny, glider-like aircraft that was coming. Temporary buildings went up first. Prefabricated huts, canvas tents, crude wooden barracks. Fuel tanks appeared, water was trucked in. Power lines were stretched. A crude mess hall took shape. The desert swallowed the noise. Kelly Johnson moved fast because he always moved fast. He had a habit of writing short memos with impossible deadlines and then meeting them. The requirement he'd given his team was brutally simple. Deliver a jet-powered camera platform that could cruise above 70,000 feet and stay there long enough to photograph half a continent in razor detail. The result was the U-2, a strange hybrid of sailplane and spy plane with impossibly long wings, a fragile landing gear, and an altitude ceiling that put it in a region of the sky no one had really lived in before. To test something that radical, Groom Lake didn't have to be comfortable. It had to be survivable. Early life at what would become Area 51 was harsh and basic. The people flown or driven in were told they worked at a test range or a special project, and that they would talk about none of it with anyone. They slept in cramped barracks that baked in the day and froze at night. Dust got into everything: bunks, food, lungs, camera mechanisms. The wind could strip paint. The nearest real town might as well have been on another planet. Daily routine followed a pattern that became a kind of secret monasticism. Early wake-ups, briefings, long hours in hangars where new aircraft shapes were assembled, tweaked, patched, and cursed at. Mechanics learned how to baby an airplane that was lighter and more delicate than anything they were used to. Pilots trained in high-altitude physiology, practiced in trainers, and got fitted for pressure suits that were closer to space gear than normal flight gear. Intelligence officers worked on targets and routes, translating fuzzy map coordinates into real places on the other side of the world. Security culture was total. Workers were compartmented. You might know the piece you were machining, but not the overall shape. You might see a strange tail section on a jig and never be told what the wingspan looked like, or where the thing would eventually fly. Air Force security police and CIA security officers enforced rules that bordered on paranoia. No cameras, no casual notes, no talk on the phone. Mail was screened. Contracts were bland and uninformative. Families back home were told their spouses or parents were working out of state on defense work, which was technically true and completely unhelpful. The remoteness helped. There weren't many people around to notice an airfield slowly blooming in the middle of a dry lake. But remoteness isn't invisibility. Contractors talked in bars. Truckers noticed routes. Nevadans already had a healthy respect for the weird things that happened around the test site. Flashes on the horizon, rumbling ground, the occasional mushroom cloud, and Groom Lake blended into that existing culture of don't ask too many questions. By mid-1955, the first U-2 prototypes were ready to test. When they finally arrived at Groom, flown in pieces and assembled in sealed hangars, it changed the character of the place overnight. The base stopped being a construction camp and became an organism built around a single machine. The U-2 program itself was elegantly ruthless. The idea was to fly what were officially called weather reconnaissance flights, often filed under civilian or innocuous designations, that would in reality cross deep into Soviet airspace. The aircraft's enormous wings and single powerful engine gave it the ability to reach altitudes the Soviets insisted were unreachable. At more than 70,000 feet, the air is too thin for standard control surfaces to behave normally. There's almost no margin between stall speed and overspeed, a narrow band pilots called the coffin corner. Flying there required intense concentration and trust in both the airframe and the ground crews who kept it alive. Under the fuselage and in its bays, the U-2 carried cameras that were, for the time, almost absurdly advanced. Long focal-length lenses, stabilized platforms, film that could capture fine details from the edge of space. A single successful overflight could photograph bomber bases, missile sites, naval yards, rail lines, and industrial complexes, turning the unknowable interior of the Soviet Union into a series of analyzable images. This mattered because it began to replace fear-driven guessing with data. U-2 photography showed that the bomber gap was largely a mirage. The Soviets didn't have hundreds of long-range bombers ready to cross the pole in a surprise attack. The missile gap fears that would come slightly later were also tempered by high-altitude imagery that showed what actually existed on the ground. American war planners could start basing their decisions on the number of shadows cast by real aircraft, the layout of actual missile pads, the footprints of radar complexes, instead of on worst-case estimates and political theatrics. Those flights had side effects, some of them very far from Moscow. Civilians in the American West started reporting strange, bright dots moving across the sky at dusk, or just after sunset. At the time, commercial airliners topped out around 20,000 to 30,000 feet. Military jets went higher but still lived in a familiar band of sky. The U-2 flew at more than double those altitudes. Seen from the ground, especially as the sun dipped below the horizon for the observer, but still lit the aircraft itself, the spy plane could gleam unnaturally bright, moving slowly and silently compared to normal traffic. Air traffic controllers sometimes saw something blip at an impossible altitude. Pilots reported lights above them that didn't match any known aircraft profile. UFO reports spiked in some regions during U-2 test phases and operational flights. Much later, some officials would acknowledge that a significant percentage of unexplained sightings in the 1950s and early 1960s lined up with U-2 operations. But we're flying a secret plane that shouldn't exist, at a height we claim is impossible, wasn't a confession they were ready to make. Of course, not every strange object in the sky can be reduced to a classified flight plan. Even inside programs like this, some people saw things they couldn't easily file under known aircraft, or atmospheric phenomena. The desert sky invited that kind of uncertainty. When your job already involves machines that push against what was considered physically achievable, it becomes harder to say with confidence where the boundary of the possible really is. Strategically, though, the impact of the U-2 was unambiguous. Its photographs informed arms control debates, military budgets, and nuclear targeting lists. They reassured some leaders that the United States was not, in fact, about to be swarmed by an overwhelming Soviet bomber fleet. They also confirmed that the Soviet nuclear program was real, growing, and aimed squarely at American cities and bases. That combination of reassurance and alarm shaped how both sides thought about deterrence, first strike scenarios, and the balance of terror. Back at Groom Lake, this translated into an odd psychological mix. The people living in those shabby barracks, eating in that dusty mess hall, and stepping out into nights so dark you could see the Milky Way like a river, knew that the work they were doing had immediate global consequences. But their footprint on the map was tiny, a remote strip of light in an empty basin, sending fragile black silhouettes into a sky that, to almost everyone else on Earth, still looked perfectly normal. The U-2 made Groom Lake real as a concept, a place where technology and secrecy combined to change the course of the Cold War. It also established the pattern that would define the base for decades. A new aircraft arrives, the facilities warp around it, the world outside notices odd things without knowing what they're seeing, and policy shifts based on information extracted from skies no one is supposed to access. And as those high flights continued, and planners digested frame after frame of Soviet reality, someone in Washington asked a predictable question. If we can do this once, what else can we do? The answer, as usual, was more. Bigger, higher, stranger. Groom Lake had started as a one-plane monastery, but once you have a working secret base, the temptation is to turn it into a whole secret world. The U-2 program proved that this lonely lakebed could produce the kind of intelligence that shifted nuclear strategy. That kind of leverage buys a lot of budget. It also attracts other people with classified wish lists. Within a few years, the place that had been a handful of barracks and a runway scraped into mudflat started growing extra limbs. On paper, it was still just a remote test site. In reality, the map inside the fence began to fill. Temporary hangars became permanent. Light sheet metal buildings turned into large, insulated structures with sealed doors and internal bays. The single runway on the lakebed was backed up by a paved strip, then extended again, as planners thought ahead to heavier, faster aircraft that hadn't even reached the drawing board stage. With growth came layers of naming. Officially, this was a part of the Nevada test site, designated Area 51 in the grid that carved the desert into numbered blocks. Inside the black programs that used it, it was Watertown, a nod to CIA Director Alan Dulles' hometown. Later, it would be called Paradise Ranch in recruiting pitches, to make it sound less miserable to engineers and pilots who were already living on base coffee and desert grit. Different agencies used different terms. Groom Lake, the ranch, the site. Each label hid more than it revealed. Those code names were matched by a way of thinking. Compartmentalization became religion. The U-2 had already been secret, but it was still a single coherent project. As the base expanded, it became normal for multiple programs to live side by side, sealed off from each other by classification walls you could feel but not see. You might be cleared for one code word and not another. That meant you could walk past a hangar every day for years and never be allowed to know what lived inside it. Pilots were briefed only on the missions they would fly. Mechanics were trained on specific subsystems, not full airframes. If you needed to cross from one building to another, you might go through airlocks, badge readers, security checks, each one a reminder that your knowledge was deliberately partial. The logic was simple. If one piece leaked, the rest might survive. But the psychological effect was more complex. People lived entire careers inside sealed narratives. They knew they were part of something big, but they only ever saw fragments. That's the kind of environment where rumor and speculation thrive, even among the insiders. Of course, a growing base needs more than extra fences. It needs power, water, food, fuel, spare parts, paperwork, and people. Lots of people. By the early 1960s, Groom Lake was no longer a Spartan camp. It had expanded dormitories, a cafeteria that could feed hundreds, a small clinic, maintenance shops, a fire department, storage tanks and pipelines, underground fuel systems, and a quiet forest of antennas and radomes on the surrounding hills. There were recreational rooms because even in a black program, someone eventually notices that exhausted people make more mistakes. All of that had to be supplied without announcing to the world that a major airbase existed, where maps still showed nothing. Convoys came in at odd hours, fuel trucks rolled off highways onto unmarked roads. Mail passed through intermediaries. Official addresses pointed to nondescript offices in Las Vegas or Burbank. Salaries were paid by cover companies that specialized in being forgettable. The most elegant part of this hidden ecosystem was the daily commute. If you lived in Las Vegas in the 1960s and 70s, you might look up at McCarran Airport on a weekday morning and see something odd: a cluster of anonymous white and gray airliners with a single red stripe, no airline logos, parked at a terminal that rarely made the travel brochures. People in plain clothes would park their cars, walk into a low building, and vanish into a world of restricted flight schedules. These were the flights that would come to be known as Janet. That's not an official acronym anyone has meaningfully explained. It's just a call sign used by the small fleet of aircraft that shuttle workers in and out of the classified ranges. Pilots and controllers needed a word to say over the radio. Janet was the one they got. Every weekday morning, those planes loaded engineers, technicians, clerks, security officers, and pilots, flew them north over the desert, and set them down on a runway that didn't officially exist. At the end of the day, the process reversed. From the air, each trip was a short hop. From the inside, it was a daily border crossing between two realities. People who rode those flights signed thick stacks of non-disclosure agreements. They learned to answer questions about their job with vague phrases: "I work out at the test site," or "I do government contracting." Their kids knew that mom or dad left before dawn and came back after dark and couldn't talk about what they did in between. Even among spouses, details were often off limits. To outside observers, Janet flights themselves became part of the mystery. Plane spotters tracked tail numbers that didn't show up in normal airline registries. Radio hobbyists listened to call signs that never carried tourists or business travelers. Las Vegas cab drivers knew the terminal but didn't know where their passengers were really going. The commute became a kind of open secret that everyone could see and no one could officially acknowledge. That dynamic, visible traces of something unnamed fed directly into the legend building up around Area 51. The more the government refused to talk about the base, the more people wanted to know what demanded that level of silence. Locals traded stories about low-flying aircraft with bizarre silhouettes, about nights when the sky silently pulsed with light over the northern ranges. Hunters, miners, and ranchers in the wider region reported sonic booms with no contrails, or contrails that appeared and vanished in ways they hadn't seen before. Some of those were almost certainly prototypes roaring out of Groom. Some may have been other classified projects in the broader test complex, and some accounts, even decades later, don't neatly match any known test schedule or aircraft type. Inside the fence, those stories were mostly background noise. People were too busy wrestling with oxygen systems, radar signatures, structural loads. But they also knew that secrecy wasn't just a protective shield. It was an active ingredient. The less you said, the more others would fill the void with their own ideas. In that sense, Groom Lake's growth turned into a kind of feedback loop. Each new hangar, each additional runway, each extra Janet flight out of Las Vegas created more physical reality on the ground and more unanswered questions in the air. A temporary test strip had become a permanent node in a much larger hidden architecture, one that stretched through logistics pipelines, cover stories, code names, and commuter jets to shape not just what flew in the desert, but what people imagined flew there. And as the projects got faster and stranger, the gap between what the public thought might be happening at Area 51 and what was actually rolling out of those hangars only widened. The next leap started with a simple complaint. The U-2 was suddenly too slow, too low, and way too visible. By the late 1950s, Soviet radar had learned its silhouette. Surface-to-air missiles were catching up. The CIA and the Air Force wanted something that didn't just edge past defenses, but outran them so completely that interception became a math problem the other side couldn't solve. Lockheed Skunk Works came back with an answer that looked less like an airplane and more like something that had slipped through from a different timeline. Project Oxcart, the A-12. On paper, it was a reconnaissance aircraft like the U-2. In practice, it belonged to a new category, a machine that could cruise above 80,000 feet and sustain speeds over Mach 3. That meant problems that didn't exist for normal planes suddenly became the whole job. At those speeds, air isn't a gentle fluid, it's a battering ram. Friction turns the skin of the aircraft into a heating element. The edges of the A-12 could glow cherry red in flight. Rivets, paints, oils, fuel, seals, everything had to be reconsidered. Aluminum would soften and fail. Steel was too heavy. So Skunk Works turned to titanium, a metal that was light, strong, and temperamental. It ate through tools, cracked if handled wrong, and in a twist of Cold War irony, much of the ore came from the very country the plane was being designed to spy on, the Soviet Union, through layers of front companies and intermediaries. Even acquiring raw material was a covert operation. Engines were another nightmare. You couldn't just bolt on bigger jets and call it a day. The J-58 power plants that the A-12 carried were part turbojet, part ramjet. At low speeds, they behaved like conventional engines. At high speeds, most of the air bypassed the core entirely and was rammed straight into the afterburner. Managing that transition without tearing the airplane apart took an orchestra of moving inlets, bleed doors, and fuel controls. Those inlets, the sharp-edged cones on the front of each engine nacelle, became their own universe of headaches. A tiny mispositioning at Mach 3 could cause an unstart, a sudden disruption of airflow that slammed the plane with asymmetric drag and yaw. Pilots described it like being hit by a truck from the side. At 2,000 miles an hour, that kind of surprise could end you in a heartbeat. And over all of this hung a new obsession: radar cross-section. The Oxcart team wasn't just building for speed. They were experimenting with shrinking the plane's radar footprint long before stealth was a buzzword. They canted the vertical tails inward. They sculpted the chines along the forward fuselage to deflect radar waves. They used a special radar-absorbing iron ferrite in the black paint that gave the aircraft its iconic dark sheen. It didn't make the A-12 invisible, but it made it harder to see, especially when paired with altitude and speed. Early, imperfect stealth, tested, refined, and argued over in windowless rooms at Groom. Groom Lake was where theory got punished by reality. The base expanded again to handle this new creature. Longer runways, taller hangars with larger doors, fuel systems built to pump a special low-volatility kerosene that wouldn't boil away in the heat of high Mach flight. Maintenance shops full of jigs and fixtures, custom designed to coax titanium into shape. Test flights began in 1962. Crews gave the aircraft nicknames: Sled, Beast, the Article. Officially, the pilots flying it were sheep-dipped, stripped from their military identities and folded into CIA cover. If they died, the story wouldn't mention the airplane they'd actually been in. They flew over the empty Nevada ranges first, working up from subsonic to supersonic to full 3 times the speed of sound runs. Every step revealed some new quirk, leaks that only appeared when the structure heated and expanded, panels that warped, instruments that lied. The line between engineering test and survival exercise was razor thin. Inside the cockpit, life support was its own issue. At those altitudes, there was no margin for decompression. Pilots wore pressure suits closer to space gear than flight jackets, training in altitude chambers and centrifuges before they were even allowed to strap in. If something went wrong at speed, ejection was a violent birth into a thin, freezing, hypoxic world where your suit was the only barrier between you and death. And yet, they kept going, because Oxcart wasn't alone. The basic airframe and technologies spawned a family. The A-12 was the CIA's single-seat spy plane, optimized for photography. The Air Force wanted something that could carry missiles. That mutation became the YF-12, an interceptor variant with a 2-man crew, a modified nose, and internal bays for air-to-air weapons designed to chase down Soviet bombers at ridiculous speeds. Then there was the SR-71 Blackbird, outwardly similar to the A-12, but stretched, reworked, and repurposed for the Air Force as a strategic reconnaissance platform. 2 seats instead of 1. Different sensor options. Modified chines and chines-to-wing blending. Redesigned inlets. New mission profiles. They shared a silhouette and an ancestry, but under the skin they were different answers to different questions. All of them, though, made their proving runs out of the same desert. From the outside, you didn't see code names or variant numbers. You saw streaks. Farmers, miners, and hikers on the far edges of restricted airspace reported razor-thin contrails that seemed to appear out of nowhere, make impossible turns, or vanish abruptly. Sonic booms rattled windows at odd hours. Bright points of light carved impossible, feeling arcs high overhead, moving faster than commercial traffic ever did. If you didn't know that titanium-skinned reconnaissance aircraft were ripping across the sky at 3 times the speed of sound, you reached for other explanations. Experimental craft, secret weapons, maybe not entirely human technology. Some of those sightings almost certainly trace back to A-12s, YF-12s, and early Blackbirds. Others don't line up neatly with any declassified flight logs or performance envelopes. Multiple time zones of weirdness coexisted. The official black projects we now know about, and perhaps other programs, still buried, that rode on the same logistics chain and took off from the same runways. The government's response to all of this was, predictably, silence. When asked about strange lights or booming skies, officials might blame weather balloons, conventional jets, atmospheric phenomena, anything but a titanium arrow doing Mach 3 at the edge of space. That denial strategy worked in one sense. The A-12 and its siblings remained mostly hidden during their operational prime. But it also poured gasoline on the fire of speculation. If people knew something fast and exotic was flying out there, and the government refused to say what, the imagination did the rest. So the Blackbird era did more than push engineering into the red zone. It turned the skies above Nevada into a stage where known physics and unknown intentions overlapped. Some of what crossed that stage we can name now: Oxcart, YF-12, SR-71. Some of it still lives in redacted memos and half-remembered stories. And even in the programs we think we understand, there were costs the glossy photos never showed. For every sleek publicity shot of a Blackbird, there's a line on a memorial wall, or a wreckage field the public never heard about. High-performance flight testing is, by definition, a process of finding out what breaks. At Groom, they found out a lot. In January 1963, an A-12 on a test mission out of Nevada broke up near Wendover, Utah. The official story given to the locals was that a conventional military jet had crashed. Recovery crews swept the desert, picking up titanium shards and classified camera systems. Residents who reached the site early were quietly warned not to talk about what they'd seen. The pilot died. His death notice didn't mention the aircraft type or the program he'd been risking his life for. He wasn't the last. Another A-12 was lost near Las Vegas in 1964 after an in-flight emergency. The pilot ejected, survived, then was instructed to tell anyone who asked that he'd been flying an F-105. Debriefings focused on keeping the cover story straight as much as they focused on what had gone wrong with the airplane. In the balance between secrecy and truth usually lost. The YF-12 program saw its own share of incidents. The SR-71 family, operating from other bases but drawing on lessons born at Groom, suffered catastrophic failures when inlet control systems hiccuped at the wrong moment, or when tiny structural flaws turned into fatal cascades at Mach 3. Each of those accidents traced back to the same nexus of people, facilities, and procedures that defined Area 51's culture. The price wasn't just paid in sudden violent moments over the test ranges. It was paid slowly in long hours and long exposures. Pilots weren't the only ones living on the edge. Engineers slept in cinder block dorms a few hundred yards from hangars, where exotic fuels, cutting agents, and classified materials were stored. Mechanics worked in fumes from high-temperature coatings and sealants. Security teams burned classified waste in pits because shredders and recycling weren't an option when your paperwork described systems that officially didn't exist. When something crashed, recovery wasn't just about honoring the dead. It was about erasing evidence. Teams fanned out across mountains and valleys, digging out buried fragments, collecting suspiciously advanced scrap before a rancher or hiker could pick it up. Local sheriffs and coroners were leaned on to cooperate. Death certificates were vague. Witnesses were nudged toward acceptable explanations. Engine trouble, training mishap, nothing unusual here. The human toll from all this secrecy extended beyond the cockpit. Decades later, In the 1990s, a different kind of story leaked out of the desert. Not about aliens or reverse-engineered saucers, but about what happened to the trash. Former workers from the Groom Lake area described open pits where solvents, paints, radar-absorbing materials, and composite scraps were dumped and burned. They talked about smoke that made their eyes burn, and their lungs seize, about being ordered to bulldoze mystery drums into trenches and cover them with dirt. They weren't given respirators. They weren't told what the chemicals were. They were told not to ask. Some of those workers developed strange rashes, breathing problems, autoimmune disorders. A few of them, and the families of others who had already died, took the government to court, arguing that classified operations had poisoned them. That lawsuit, brought by people like janitors, mechanics, and support staff, crashed head-on into the same wall of secrecy that had hidden so many crash sites. When their lawyers asked what had been burned and buried at Groom, the government replied that answering would reveal classified information. Not necessarily about UFOs or exotic propulsion, but about radar, stealth materials, sensor technologies, and how black projects handled hazardous waste. Presidents signed orders exempting the site from certain environmental disclosure rules. Courts were told they couldn't weigh the evidence because the evidence itself was a national security secret. One former worker's widow wanted to know what had scarred her husband's lungs so badly his skin started peeling. The official answer was essentially that knowing would be too dangerous for the country. So she and others like her were left with fragments, symptoms, rumors, the smell of those burn pits that never quite left their memories. Were they exposed to experimental composites, classified fuels, something more exotic? Or were they victims of the same kind of careless chemical handling you could find at any mid-century industrial site, just wrapped in an extra layer of classification? Without documentation, it's hard to say, and that's the point. Secrecy didn't just protect platforms and missions. It made it nearly impossible to trace cause and effect. If a pilot's pressure suit failed after repeated exposure to unknown cabin contaminants, the technical report went into a safe. If an engineer's cancer rate matched patterns seen at other contaminated bases, the comparison couldn't be made, because you weren't even supposed to admit what had been stored in those hangars. At a place like Area 51, every risk calculation was skewed. You couldn't notify nearby communities about potential hazards because you officially weren't there. You couldn't bring in outside inspectors without exposing projects whose whole existence depended on staying unacknowledged. You couldn't even put certain warning labels on containers without tipping off the wrong set of eyes about what materials you were using. So decisions were made inside a very small circle. And when those decisions turned out to be wrong, the people who suffered bore the consequences in private. From the outside, that opacity looks like a blank screen. People fill it with whatever story makes the most sense to them. Secret weapons gone wrong, alien artifacts that can't be handled safely, interdimensional tech leaking radiation into the dirt. Inside that blank space, we know at least this much. Bleeding-edge jets crashed, and men died flying them. Support crews worked around substances no one would allow in an ordinary workplace today. Families were given folded flags, or non-answers, or both. The hidden costs of Area 51 aren't just in budget line items or in classified hangars full of retired prototypes. They're in unmarked graves, unexplained illnesses, and a desert landscape that has absorbed decades of experiments the rest of the world wasn't permitted to see. And even as those costs piled up, the projects that created them were still hungry for more data, more performance, more advantage. Which raises a question. What exactly were they testing out there, besides American aircraft? They weren't just testing what we built. They were testing what everyone else built too. From the beginning, Groom wasn't just a launch pad for strange American prototypes. It was a dissecting table, a place where anything that flew and wasn't ours could be stripped, measured, flown, and turned into data. During the Cold War, the highest compliment you could pay an enemy airplane was to panic hard enough that you had to get one for yourself. The Soviets were rolling out fighters that, on paper, could challenge or even outclass American jets. MiG-15s in Korea, MiG-21s and MiG-23s later on. Radar we didn't fully understand. Missiles we'd only seen in grainy reconnaissance photos. Paper wasn't good enough. The people designing American aircraft and radar needed numbers, not guesses. Engineers wanted to know exactly how a MiG radar lit you up, how its wings stalled, how its missiles tracked, how its pilot saw the battle. So the United States quietly went shopping. Some of those purchases were political. A MiG-21 flown out of Iraq by a defector. Another acquired through Israel after Arab-Israeli wars. Bits and pieces traded, borrowed, or just never returned. By the late 1960s and 70s, the US had enough Soviet and foreign hardware to justify a whole category of programs, take their jets apart, fly them against ours, and rewrite the playbook. One of the names that eventually leaked into public view was Have Donut, a project that evaluated a captured MiG-21. There were others with similarly harmless sounding code names: Have Drill, Have Ferry, Constant Peg. The pattern was the same. Move the foreign aircraft somewhere remote. Strip off the markings. Paint them in neutral colors or American schemes. Then fly them until every quirk and weakness had been charted. The question is, where do you do that? You need long runways, specialized maintenance, foreign language technical manuals, security teams who won't panic when they see a red star taxiing by, and enough isolation that no airline passenger looks out a window and says, "Hey, is that a Soviet fighter at an American base?" Groom Lake checked every box. Declassified documents and pilot memoirs point to a nearby subsite at Tonopah Test Range as another hub for these foreign materiel exploitation programs. Some aircraft definitely lived there, but pilots also describe flying into Groom, being briefed in windowless rooms, then climbing into jets that didn't exist on US inventory lists. They talk about the surreal moment of taxiing out in an enemy cockpit, wearing a US flight suit, listening to American controllers speaking in clear Nevada drawls. Practicing dogfights where the bandit is real, an actual MiG on the other end of the merge, not a simulator. For American fighter tactics, that was revolutionary. You stop guessing what a MiG can do and start knowing. You discover that the myth of Soviet invincibility doesn't match the airplane's actual turn rate, climb, or radar modes. Or you discover the opposite, that some systems are better than your own, and you need to change your training yesterday. Reverse engineering wasn't just about copying parts. It was about rewriting the entire invisible dance of modern air combat. If you know exactly when a MiG's radar will lose lock, you can design a maneuver to exploit that. If you know the exact shape of its radar cross-section, you can tune your stealth, or your jammers, or your missiles to eat it alive. That's the sober, documented side of the captured technology story. Foreign jets, flown by US pilots, under layers of classification and cover names. Beyond that, the stories get stranger. There are claims that Groom hosted not only Soviet fighters, but also pieces of more advanced systems, foreign radar arrays, missile seekers, electronic warfare pods, even prototype drones picked up in shadowy deals or recovered from conflict zones. Some of that is plausible. Militaries constantly tried to lay hands on each other's electronics. A radar van abandoned after a retreat, a missile that failed to detonate, a drone that crashed mostly intact. It would be surprising if some of that hardware didn't pass through the same black world infrastructure that serviced Groom. Then there are the stories that edge into the exotic. Craft with performance envelopes that don't match any known jet. Triangular outlines, sharp boomerang shapes, flying foreign only in the sense that no one admits to owning them. Some say they were testbeds built to mimic rumored Soviet projects. Others argue they were prototypes of American concepts, so radical they might as well have been alien. And threaded through all of this is the idea that foreign might mean more than just Russian or Chinese. That among the cataloged MiGs and Sukhois and captured SAM components, there were objects that didn't match any earthly design language. Materials that resisted standard analysis. Performance that didn't fit conventional aerodynamics. Officially, there's no confirmation of that. Unofficially, the habit pattern is the same. If you acquire something you don't understand and you absolutely cannot afford the rest of the world to know you have it, you take it somewhere like Groom. You put it in a hangar that doesn't photograph well from orbit. You put badges on every door. You fly it, or at least try to, over ranges where every eye belongs to you. Whether we're talking about a MiG-21, a borrowed radar, or something genuinely unprecedented, the logic fits. A secret test site built to evaluate exotic American aircraft is almost tailor-made to evaluate exotic foreign ones. The same runways, the same secure telemetry, the same culture of compartmentalization. Pilots are already used to lying about what they flew today. Mechanics are already used to working from incomplete manuals. Security is already used to answering questions with a smile and a non-answer. Now imagine standing on a Nevada ridgeline in the 1970s or 80s. You're a rancher, or a lineman, or a bored conscript at some other range. It's twilight. Off in the distance, over restricted airspace, you see an aircraft silhouette that every training poster says belongs to the enemy, or a configuration that belongs to no one. It moves in ways that don't look like the F-4s and F-111s you're used to. It lights up the sky with strange patterns as test avionics cycle on and off. Do you conclude you've witnessed a classified foreign material test? Or do you reach for a different label? Alien, otherworldly, impossible? And what if what you saw really did push what was possible? A captured fighter with unfamiliar afterburner plumes. A hybrid testbed mixing US and Soviet hardware. An experimental platform borrowing an adversary's aerodynamics, but driven by something completely new. Each step away from the familiar makes it easier for witnesses to frame the sighting as something beyond human engineering altogether. The more Groom became a crossroads for other nations' secrets, the fuzzier the line between our technology and their technology became. Data from foreign aircraft fed directly into our stealth designs, our missiles, our radars. A Soviet jet landing at Groom today might become a subtle tweak to an American warplane tomorrow. So when people say Area 51 was about studying alien technology, sometimes they mean literal aliens. Sometimes they mean adversary nations. Sometimes they mean technologies so unfamiliar that, for a while, they felt alien even to the people testing them. Either way, the pattern holds. If you found it, stole it, lured it across a border, or picked it up smoking in a field half a world away, and it had wings or antennas or strange electronics, there was a good chance it would eventually pass through the shadow of that dry lake bed in Nevada. And while the classified reports framed those projects in terms of performance charts and radar plots, the people watching from the darkened edges of the desert saw something else entirely. Foreign shapes in a forbidden sky, doing things no ordinary airplane did. Those sightings would soon feed into a different narrative, one where foreign no longer meant Moscow or Beijing, but somewhere much farther away. By the 1970s, the arms race had a new scoreboard. It wasn't just about how fast you could go, or how high you could climb, or how many missiles you could cram under the wings. Those things still mattered, but radar had quietly become the real sovereign of the sky. If the enemy could see you, they could shoot you, and their radars were getting better. Vietnam had already been a brutal teacher. American pilots watched surface-to-air missiles rise out of nowhere, guided by radar beams they couldn't see, toward airplanes that cost as much as small cities. The message was simple. Speed alone wasn't going to save you forever. So a strange, almost counterintuitive idea moved from theory to obsession. Don't outrun the radar. Disappear from it. The basic physics had been explored on paper for years. Radar sends out energy. It bounces off a target. You measure the reflection. Change the shape and materials of the target, and you can change the reflection. In principle, you might even shrink it so much that you look like a bird, or a bug, or background noise. On paper, though, stealth looked ugly, literally. The math that described how radar waves reflected off surfaces didn't care about aesthetics. It preferred flat faces and sharp angles, not the smooth curving lines aircraft designers loved, but faceted shapes that looked like someone had built an airplane out of broken mirrors and bad dreams. Lockheed's Skunk Works, the same outfit that had given the world the U-2 and the A-12, decided to try anyway. They took Soviet research on radar scattering, combined it with their own secret work, and fed the equations into early computers. Out came a design that barely looked flyable, a jagged diamond-shaped thing that seemed more like a glitch than a plane. They called the concept Have Blue. Have Blue wasn't intended to be a combat aircraft. It was a proof of concept. Could you build a manned airplane whose main job was to almost not exist on radar? Could you make it fly straight, stay in the air, and come back, while being effectively invisible to the systems that ruled modern warfare? To answer that, you needed a place where you could crash, explode, fail, and try again in total secrecy. somewhere with instrumentation that could measure your radar signature from every angle, somewhere with long runways, dry weather, secure perimeters, and no neighbors peeking over the fence. Once again, Groom Lake was the obvious answer. Have blue prototypes began to appear there in the late 1970s. To anyone outside the fence, they were pure anomaly. No national markings, weird angles, small size, and performance that didn't match any known silhouette. At a distance, especially at dusk or under floodlights, they looked less like aircraft and more like black wedges slicing through the night. Test flights emphasized the ghost part of the equation. Stealth only works if you avoid being seen as well as being tracked. So much of the flying happened at night. Pilots would take off under cover of darkness, climb into restricted airspace, and perform maneuvers over instrumented ranges while radar dishes and tracking cameras tried, and mostly failed, to see them. Imagine being one of the few people allowed to watch. A radar tech in a bunker staring at a screen that should be lighting up like Christmas whenever an aircraft is in the sky. Instead, you see almost nothing. A faint blip here, a whisper there, sometimes nothing at all, while you hear the roar of an engine overhead. Now imagine you're not in the bunker. You're out in the desert on some lonely road. It's after midnight. You see a strange angular object fly silently at first, jet noise lagging behind it, banking in ways that don't look quite right, without the usual constellation of navigation lights. It glides, it pivots, it flashes odd glows as test systems cycle on and off. If you don't have the context of radar cross-section validation program, you might reasonably file that away as something non-human. Inside the fence, Have Blue did what it was supposed to do. It proved that an aircraft could be engineered primarily around the goal of being hard to see rather than pleasant to fly. It was unstable, twitchy, and unforgiving. 2 prototypes were built. Both eventually crashed, but the data survived, and that was what mattered. From Have Blue grew the 117 Nighthawk. Officially, the F-117 was a fighter, but that label was camouflage. It was a stealth attack jet designed to slip through dense radar networks, drop precision weapons, and leave before anyone realized what had happened. Its shape was a refined evolution of those early faceted prototypes: flat panels, razor edges, a cockpit blended into facets, like a gemstone that had learned to hate reflections. Before the world ever saw it, Groom and its associated ranges saw almost everything. Pilots learned to tame its quirks at night over Nevada. Engineers tweaked coatings, panel gaps, and edges based on measurements taken in radar ranges buried in the desert. Maintenance crews learned how to deal with exotic materials that didn't behave like normal aluminum skins. All of this happened while, officially, the F-117 did not exist. The Air Force even created phantom units and cover stories. People with F-117 patches on their flight suits told friends and family they flew A-7s or F-16s. Aircraft were ferried at strange hours, stored in guarded hangars, and flown on routes designed to minimize accidental sightings. Despite that, there were sightings. Hunters, truckers, and insomniacs reported seeing black angular shapes in the Nevada sky years before the Pentagon admitted anything. Some described them as triangles, others as sharp-edged diamonds with glowing exhausts that seemed too quiet, too controlled. They spoke of aircraft that appeared as dark voids against the stars, with edges that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. From the outside, in the absence of declassified project names and stealth theory, you're left with rumor and intuition. You see something that doesn't match any plane in Jane's All the World's aircraft. It moves deliberately, sometimes slowly, without obvious wings or tail. It flies when normal test activity is supposedly shut down. It doesn't show up on the local radar repeater. Do you conclude that black-budget engineers just want another round of hide-and-seek with radar? Or do you wonder if a completely different origin is being hidden under that same blanket of secrecy? The truth is layered. On one level we know, because the documents and the aircraft themselves eventually emerged, that Groom played a central role in turning stealth from a wild theory into a deployed capability. Have Blue, the F-117, and likely follow-on designs lived significant parts of their lives there, growing from sketches and equations into real metal that flew. On another level, the very existence of stealth proved something else: that the government could operate an entire class of aircraft for years, even decades, without public acknowledgement. Jets could take off from and land at a base that wasn't there, in squadrons that didn't exist, under budgets that appeared only as cryptic lines in classified annexes. Once you accept that, the leap to what else could they be hiding doesn't feel very long. If we could make an airplane that barely showed up on radar, why not one that barely showed up at all? If we could build shapes that defied conventional design language in the 1970s, what might be flying now, 40 or 50 years later, in the same protected airspace? Some argue that every triangular UFO over Nevada was just the next iteration of stealth, each generation weirder and more efficient, using Groom as its cradle. Others suggest that stealth itself might have benefited from studying objects that didn't fit any known catalog, recovered hardware, exotic materials, or phenomena we still don't fully understand. We don't have definitive answers for those more speculative layers. What we do have is a pattern. Every time a radical shift in aviation emerged from the U-2 to the Blackbird to stealth, it passed through that dry lake bed and its hidden hangars. Every time, people outside the fence saw hints and shadows years before the press conferences. Every time, the official story arrived late, partial and carefully worded. So when stealth finally stepped into the daylight, when the F-117 was rolled out and given a name, Groom Lake didn't become less mysterious. In some ways, it became more so. Because if that was what they were willing to show us, after hiding it for so long, it raised a quiet, insistent question in the back of a lot of minds. What still flies out there in the dark, with no name at all? By the early 1980s, Groom Lake was no longer just a blank spot on the map. It was a blank spot people had started talking about. The base still didn't officially exist, but the sky around it did, and that sky was busy. Aviation buffs with long lenses camped on distant ridgelines, trading notes on radio chatter and strange contrails. Local ranchers swapped stories in diners about odd lights that rose straight up and then darted off at impossible angles. Long-haul truckers rolling across Highway 375 watched sharp-edged silhouettes cross the Milky Way and wondered what, exactly, the Air Force was cooking out there. Newspapers occasionally ran small pieces about mystery military facilities in Nevada. A few defense journalists, reading between procurement lines and satellite photos, hinted that there was a test range near Groom Lake doing very advanced work. Nobody used the name Area 51 on television yet, but the desert itself had started to whisper. Then, in 1989, it stopped whispering and started yelling. A man calling himself Dennis appeared on a Las Vegas TV station, sitting in shadow, voice distorted. He claimed he had worked at a site near Groom Lake S4, where the United States was studying not just secret aircraft, but recovered alien craft. That man was Robert Lazar. Over a series of interviews, and later under his real name, Lazar laid out a story that was both incredibly specific and incredibly explosive. He said he was hired as a physicist to help understand the propulsion of disc-shaped craft, stored in hangars built into a hillside. He described a power source based on a stable form of element 115, something not recognized by science at the time. According to him, this material produced gravity waves, allowing the craft to bend space-time around themselves rather than pushing air out of the way like a normal jet. He talked about bus rides with blacked-out windows, security clearances, compartmentalization. He claimed he had seen briefing documents suggesting that at least one craft was of extraterrestrial origin, recovered from an archaeological dig. He described inside layouts of the discs, their size, the way the reactor sat in the center. He said he watched one of them fly, wobbling slightly as it rose off the ground. It was cinematic, detailed, and, for millions of people, instantly compelling. Lazar's story resonated for several reasons. First, timing. The public had just learned that stealth aircraft like the F-117 had been flying in secret for years. If the government could hide an entire fleet of invisible attack jets, why not something stranger? Second, the setting. Groom Lake was already accumulating a mythos. Strange lights, tight security, no acknowledgement. Dropping an alien reverse engineering program into that landscape felt plausible, at least emotionally. Third, Lazar himself didn't fit the stereotype of a wild-eyed crank. He was calm, methodical, technically fluent. He drew diagrams, used jargon, admitted when he didn't know something. That mix of specificity and restraint made him more believable to many listeners. At the same time, almost every element of his story runs into friction when it scrapes against the documented record. His claimed educational background at MIT and Caltech doesn't show up in alumni records. Elements of his employment history are disputed. Security procedures he describes don't always line up with what we know from other declassified programs. SFOR, as he draws it, has never appeared in any satellite imagery in the exact form he describes, though of course, if such a facility exists, concealment would be the point. The Element 115 piece sits awkwardly between fiction and foresight. Years after Lazar's interviews, scientists did synthesize a super-heavy Element 115, now called Moscovium, but only in tiny short-lived quantities. It doesn't behave like the stable, miracle fuel he described. Is that a coincidence he got the number right? A lucky guess? A garbled echo of something real? We don't have a definitive way to resolve that. And then there's the simplest, most mundane counterpoint. While Lazar speaks of flying saucers, the publicly confirmed work at Groom during that same time frame involves stealth jets, radar test platforms, and foreign aircraft evaluation. Those programs alone fully justify intense secrecy, odd flight profiles, and eerie night operations. You don't need non-human technology to explain every weird light over the desert. But you also can't use stealth jets to explain every part of Lazar's narrative. It's possible his story is fabricated. It's possible he genuinely believed things that were partial truths, misdirections, or compartmentalized cover tales. It's possible, as some have speculated, that he was fed sensational information to distract from more terrestrial black projects. It's also possible, however uncomfortable that is for Orthodox history, that pieces of what he said trace back to something genuinely exotic. What's certain is the effect. Before Lazar, Area 51 was a rumor among pilots, locals, and a small circle of defense geeks. After Lazar, Area 51 was a global meme before memes had a name. It became shorthand for the place where they hide the really big secrets. Tourists started driving out into the desert just to stare at distant fences. Authors, filmmakers, and talk radio hosts adopted Area 51 as the default address for crashed saucers and buried truths. In the 1980s, Groom Lake transitioned from a line item in classified budgets to a character in modern mythology. The base hadn't changed its mission overnight. The radar ranges and runways were still doing what they'd always done. But in the public mind, something shifted. Area 51 was no longer just where cutting-edge airplanes learned to fly. It was where anything beyond the edge might be hiding. Once Lazar cracked the door open, a flood of older stories rushed in to fill the room. People went back to the beginning, or at least to the moment American UFO mythology really took shape. Roswell, 1947. In July of that year, something came down on a ranch in New Mexico. The local Army airfield put out a press release saying they had recovered a flying disc. The next day, that statement was walked back. Suddenly, it was just a weather balloon. The debris was shipped away. Photographs were taken with balsa-looking sticks and foil. The incident was quietly buried. For decades, Roswell was a footnote. Then, in the late 1970s and 80s, witnesses and secondhand accounts started surfacing. People talked about strange metallic foil that crumpled and then sprang back into shape, about unusual beams and I-beams with strange symbols, about small bodies in child-sized coffins, or rumors of an extra hangar where those bodies were stored. The story metastasized into a full-blown legend, a crashed craft, recovered aliens, and a massive cover-up. And once Area 51 became the new, mysterious desert base in the public mind, it made emotional sense to link the two. If wreckage from something not of this world was retrieved in New Mexico, where would you take it? You'd want an isolated, secure flight test center with runways, engineers, and a blank spot on the map. Suddenly, Roswell was the crash site, and Area 51 was the garage. Books, documentaries, and late-night radio shows started sketching in the missing pieces. They described secret hangars carved into desert mountainsides, underground rail systems connecting remote facilities, long rows of craft under tarps, some human-built, some allegedly not. Pilots and contractors who had worked on perfectly terrestrial black programs like the U-2 and the F-117 talked, carefully about buried hangars and elevators that took airplanes below ground. That alone fed the idea. If you're already putting jets in underground spaces to hide them from satellites and prying eyes, what else could be hidden down there? Then you had the reverse engineering narratives. Lazar's claims about studying gravity-driven disks synced up with older rumors that the US had tried to back-engineer whatever fell at Roswell, or whatever had been tracked on radar and crashed elsewhere. Witnesses talked about non-terrestrial alloys, honeycomb metals, weightless beams. Engineers who had never seen anything alien in their careers still admitted that some of the materials they tested in certain programs behaved in ways that were, at the time, ahead of publicly known metallurgy. There's a spectrum here. On one end, you have pure folklore, bar stories, internet chain posts, anonymous "my friend's uncle" accounts that balloon in the telling. On another, you have testimony, named witnesses, sworn statements, people who stick to the same odd details over decades, even when there's no clear financial or social reward and plenty of downside. Then there are leaked claims, documents of uncertain origin, photocopies of photocopies, Majestic 12-style memos that may be genuine, may be fakes, or maybe a blend of truth and disinformation. And finally, at the other end, you have documented evidence, declassified budgets, construction contracts, satellite photos, and redacted memos that prove underground structures exist, that strange test articles were evaluated, that something unusual was happening without spelling out exactly what. The enduring motifs, underground hangars, captured craft, secret briefings about non-human intelligences, stick around, partly because they map neatly onto real practices. Compartmentalization is standard in Black programs. Need-to-know briefings with sanitized cover stories are normal. People are routinely told one explanation for what they're working on, while another layer of truth sits behind a door they will never open. That environment is a perfect incubator for stories. If you see only one sliver of a program, your mind fills in the rest. Sometimes accurately, sometimes not. It also matters that some of the wildest ideas appeared in official-looking clothing. There have been leaked, and in some cases acknowledged, briefings and slide decks within the government about non-conventional aerospace vehicles, unidentified aerial phenomena, and craft exhibiting signature management beyond known technology. Modern Navy pilot encounters have generated serious internal reports. The recent UAP task forces and hearings admit very cautiously that there are things being observed that don't fit comfortably inside current physics as publicly understood. None of that proves there are alien ships parked in Nevada. But it does create a gray zone. In that gray zone, people do what humans have always done around sacred mountains and forbidden temples. They tell stories. Some may be deliberate disinformation, seeded to distract from an experimental drone or a next-generation radar. Some may be misinterpretations of very advanced but human technology. A hypersonic test article glimpsed from the wrong angle. A flare pattern no one outside the program would recognize. Some may be genuine anomalies, observed by competent witnesses whose experiences don't fit any neat explanation we currently have. And some narratives might be a braided rope of all three: real secrecy, imaginative interpretation, and something genuinely strange at the core. When you stand far out on the desert highway at night and look toward the glow over Groom Lake, you're not just looking at runways and hangars. You're looking at a mirror people have been projecting onto for generations. For some, it reflects human ingenuity pushed to the edge of physics. For others, it reflects contact with something beyond human. For many, it reflects both at once, a belief that hidden craft, whatever their origin, have been studied, flown, and tucked away behind those guarded fences, under those runways, inside those mountain doors. The paperwork we have declassified tells one story. The testimonies, rumors, and late-night confessions tell another. Area 51 sits quietly between them, a place where secrecy is undeniable, and the ultimate nature of that secrecy is still, for now, an open question. For decades, the strangest thing about Area 51 wasn't what might be inside it. It was the fact that, officially, it didn't exist. Everybody in the region knew there was a base out there. Pilots filed avoidance routes around it. Satellite photos showed a perfectly obvious runway complex on the dry bed of Groom Lake. Maps had a blank where the base clearly sat. Workers drove to shuttle stops in Las Vegas, boarded unmarked planes, and vanished into the desert haze every morning. But if you asked the US government where they were going, the answer was nowhere in particular. Area 51 was like a word everyone used that somehow never appeared in the dictionary. It was buried under layers of cover terms: the Nevada test site, the Nellis Range, the Groom Lake facility, a remote test location. The CIA and Air Force talked around it with a kind of bureaucratic yoga, bending themselves into knots to avoid writing the name. That denial wasn't accidental. It was policy. If a place doesn't officially exist, it can be shielded from lawsuits, Freedom of Information Act requests, environmental regulations, and awkward questions from Congress. If you've got experimental spy planes, captured foreign hardware, or anything else you'd rather your adversaries not know you're testing, it's nice to have a place that lives in a legal fog. But fog doesn't last forever. By the 1990s and 2000s, the gap between we all know it's there and we refuse to admit it had become too absurd to maintain. Commercial satellites were posting crisp images of the base. Journalists had traced procurement contracts, fuel deliveries, and construction projects right to Groom Lake. Lawsuits from sick workers who claimed exposure to exotic chemicals forced the government to at least acknowledge, somewhere out there, they had burned hazardous waste. Even then, the official line was incredibly narrow. Yes, there are classified activities at a remote location. No, we're not going to name it. The word Area 51 stayed allergic to official mouths. The first real crack came not from a UFO disclosure, but from a spy plane. In 2013, after years of FOIA pressure, the CIA declassified a history of the U-2 program. Tucked inside that dry, bureaucratic narrative were a few quietly explosive admissions. The U-2, they now confirmed, had been developed and test-flown at a facility on the dry lake bed at Groom Lake, in the Nevada Test and Training Range. Maps included the familiar outline of the base. The words Area 51 appeared in black and white in a CIA-released document, not just on fan websites and conspiracy forums. Along with the U-2, the report acknowledged that later reconnaissance aircraft, most notably the A-12 Oxcart, the titanium precursor to the SR-71 Blackbird, had also been tested there. They conceded that many UFO reports in the late 1950s and 1960s likely came from civilians and even airline pilots seeing these strange, silvery darts at altitudes commercial jets couldn't reach. So, some lights in the sky the government had once shrugged off as swamp gas were, in fact, top-secret American aircraft ripping across the edge of space. The declassification confirmed pieces that aviation historians and local observers had already pieced together. It filled in dates, contractor names, deployment schedules. It mapped out how the base expanded as programs like Oxcart, the D-21 drone, and later stealth prototypes rotated through. But notice what the acknowledgement did not do. It did not list current projects. It did not discuss underground facilities, special access hangars, or any hardware beyond the 1970s. It said almost nothing about the A-12's more exotic test articles, or odd sensor pods that people claimed to have seen and handled. It didn't touch alleged foreign aircraft brought in for evaluation, or any craft later rumored to have flown out of the same runways under other code names. On paper, Area 51 was now a historical site, a place where once upon a time America had tested some now famous airplanes. The story stopped neatly right before the era when stealth geometry, hypersonic testing, and the most intense UFO lore overlapped. That gap is where speculation thrives. Partial disclosure is a strange beast. It answers enough questions to prove that secrecy was real and in many ways justified. Yes, the U-2 existed. Yes, the government lied about what those high-flying objects were. Yes, the base they said wasn't there absolutely was there. Once you've admitted that, people naturally ask, if they kept that much quiet for 50 years, what else fits in the blank spaces? When the A-12 history was later discussed more openly, additional details leaked out about obscure variants, unusual materials, and edge-of-the-envelope flight profiles. Engineers hinted at test beds for advanced radar-absorbing coatings, strange fuels, and thermal management tricks that sounded, to outsiders, borderline science fiction for their time. Those are perfectly human achievements, but they occupy the same psychological space as the wilder stories. A plane that cruises at Mach 3 and 80,000 feet feels almost as unreal, in 1965, as a disk that hangs motionless and then zips off without a sonic boom. When the government confirms the former after decades of denial, it doesn't automatically erase the latter from people's minds. Sometimes it sharpens the contrast. If the official record now admits that some UFO reports were misidentified spy planes, that still leaves a residue, the sightings that don't match known airframes, even once you account for U-2s and Blackbirds. Those leftovers are where you get multiple, conflicting interpretations. One interpretation is mundane but still fascinating. Area 51 continues to host bleeding-edge, entirely human aircraft and drones, hypersonic platforms, exotic propulsion experiments, directed energy systems that remain classified for good strategic reasons. The hints we get in budget lines and patent filings suggest there's plenty of weirdness possible without leaving the planet. Another interpretation stretches further, that among the test articles parked in those hangars, some aren't purely homegrown. Maybe foreign adversary hardware, maybe something recovered from accident sites where the debris didn't look like any known airplane. Maybe, in the most extreme telling, technology of non-human origin, studied and cautiously probed under layers of compartmentalization so deep that most people on the base never glimpse it. A third possibility is less about machines and more about narrative, that the government has sometimes leaned into the mystique. By allowing the alien legends to swirl around Area 51, they may have created a smokescreen that conveniently distracts attention from programs they really don't want discussed. Encourage the flying saucer talk just enough, and people will aim their cameras at the wrong lights. Declassified histories don't resolve that triangle. They just prove one crucial fact: the government is capable of maintaining massive, multi-decade secrets at that location. The U-2 and A-12 files are, in effect, case studies in how successful that secrecy can be. So Area 51 now lives in a paradoxical space. It is one of the most famous secret bases in the world, acknowledged in official documents, visible in high-resolution satellite images, discussed in memoirs by generals and pilots. At the same time, its current operations are wrapped in the same old silence, buttressed by the same legal tricks and need-to-know compartments. The world has been given a carefully curated scrapbook, a few black and white photos, some redacted memos, a sanitized narrative of heroic engineers and Cold War necessity. The pages after that are still glued shut, and into that sealed section, people keep pouring their own interpretations, some grounded in declassified budgets and aerospace engineering, some rooted in witness testimony and anomalous encounters, some reaching into the possibility that we're not the only intelligence to have left tracks on this planet. The base has been named, but the core of what it does, and what it might have touched, remains officially unsaid. Once a secret is half admitted, it doesn't just live in government documents. It seeps into stories. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Area 51 had slipped from rumor to fixture. It started showing up everywhere, not as a line item in a budget, but as a plot device. Science fiction writers grabbed it first. If you needed a place on Earth where impossible technology might be hidden, you no longer had to invent a name. You could just say Area 51 and your readers instantly understood. Buried hangars, unmarked runways, men with clipboards and classified clearances. Movies followed. In Independence Day, it's the vault under the desert where a captured saucer and preserved bodies of them have been stored since the 1940s. In other films and TV shows, it's the place where alien autopsies are performed, where reverse engineering of impossible engines happens, where a few insiders know the truth while the rest of the planet sleeps. Video games built levels out of it. You fight your way through corridors labeled with that familiar number. You steal prototypes, dodge security patrols, hack computers that reveal top-secret Groom Lake files. Kids who had never seen Nevada on a map could tell you, with certainty, that Area 51 had underground labs, alien tanks, maybe a door to somewhere else. Once the internet hit its stride, it did the rest. Message boards, then forums, then endless chains of videos and threads turned the base into a shared canvas. People swapped photos of strange lights over the desert, dissected blurry satellite imagery, drew 3D models of rumored underground tunnels. Fan fiction merged with alleged eyewitness testimony. One person's "I heard from a guy who worked there" became another person's foundation for a more elaborate narrative. And this didn't just live online. It bled into the real geography. North of Las Vegas, there's a long stretch of Nevada highway running along the edge of the restricted airspace. For decades, it was just a lonely two-lane road used by truckers, ranchers, and the occasional curious driver hoping to glimpse something unusual over the mountains. Then, in the 1990s, the state of Nevada officially renamed it. Nevada State Route 375 became the Extraterrestrial Highway. That wasn't an accident. It was a decision to take the base's most outlandish associations and build a tourism identity around them. You can't get into Area 51, but you can drive near its borders on a road with a name that winks at everything you're thinking about. Along that road sits the tiny town of Rachel, fewer than 100 people. No streetlights, no malls, just desert, sky, and a front row seat to the edge of the most famous restricted airspace on Earth. Rachel turned the mystery into an economy. The Little Alien, yes, that's really its name, serves burgers and pie under walls covered in saucer art, photos, and clippings. You can buy alien beer, pick up t-shirts with cartoon grays, sign guest books filled with notes from visitors who drove hours just to say they'd been there. The town hosts skywatching events. Travelers park RVs and camp by the roadside, scanning the night for anything unusual. Erratic lights, flares, silent shapes moving against the stars. Sometimes they probably see flares or training flights from Nellis. Sometimes they see nothing at all. The point is less what appears in the sky and more the ritual of looking. Road signs became part of the mythology. People stole the extraterrestrial highway sign so often that the state had to keep replacing it. Stickers and graffiti slowly turned official metal markers into layered collages of alien heads and in-jokes. Each one a tiny act of claiming the story. Souvenir shops in Las Vegas stock "I was abducted near Area 51" shirts, bobblehead aliens, glow-in-the-dark shot glasses. Bus tours advertise Area 51 day trips, which can't take you into the base, of course, but can drive you to the edge of the restricted boundary, past warning signs that hint at something serious on the other side. Over time, the secrecy itself became the attraction. The fact that you cannot cross that line, cannot see over that ridge, cannot know exactly what those lights belong to, is precisely what people are buying. They're purchasing a brush with official mystery, a selfie near a sign that says, in effect, beyond this point, the government stops answering questions. Storytelling turned a sterile testing range into a stage. Each retelling added another layer. In one version, Area 51 holds crashed saucers and stored bodies. In another, it's where time travel experiments ripped open something they shouldn't have. In yet another, it's the birthplace of a secret space fleet. Films, shows, novels, and YouTube channels cycle these ideas so often that the expectations become self-reinforcing. The base is now imagined as a place where anything is possible. Compared to that, the known reality is almost jarringly mundane. A remote military installation, concrete runways, radar sites, hangars, security patrols, people doing long commutes for work they can't describe at home, test flights that have to stay unacknowledged for years, environmental hazards that don't make for good movie posters. Yet the more ordinary that description sounds, the more people suspect it must be incomplete. Pop culture has stretched the frame so far that many find it hard to accept Area 51 as just a test site for advanced but human-built technology. The very existence of myths about alien craft and underground cities shapes what the public thinks must be hiding there. If the official version is too plain, it looks like another cover story. So you end up with parallel Area 51s. One is made of asphalt, chain link, and classified contracts. The other is made of movies, late-night radio, memes, and tourist brochures. They overlap on the same patch of Nevada desert, feeding off each other. Real secret programs generate odd lights and strange sonic booms. Culture translates those into tales of non-human visitors and impossible science. The government, for the most part, stays quiet. The town of Rachel keeps serving alien-themed burgers. The extraterrestrial highway sign keeps collecting stickers. And the legend of what might exist just beyond those no trespassing signs keeps growing. One postcard and one shared story at a time. By 2019, all of that mythology, all of those late-night conversations and road trips to the extraterrestrial highway met the internet at full speed. It started as a joke. One night in June, a college-aged guy in California made a Facebook event. The title was pure internet chaos. Storm Area 51. They can't stop all of us. The description suggested that if enough people ran toward the base at once, maybe in anime Naruto runs, they could finally see them aliens. It was a meme built out of decades of rumor. The idea that Area 51 held secrets too big to reveal. The sense that the government always knew more than it was saying. And a generation raised on irony, science fiction, and the idea that nothing on the internet is entirely serious or entirely fake. Within days, millions of people clicked interested or going. Memes exploded. People made diagrams of attack formations composed entirely of Naruto runners, Kyles punching drywall, and rock throwers. Animation loops showed thousands of stick figures sprinting past confused guards. Brands joined in, posting alien jokes for clout. Musicians and influencers announced they might show up. The phrase, "they can't stop all of us," floated from comedy into something more ambiguous. On one level, everyone knew it was absurd. This was a real military base with real armed security. The Air Force issued crisp statements reminding the public that attempting to enter a military installation was dangerous and illegal. Longtime Area 51 watchers, including people who actually lived near Rachel, looked at the event page and thought, if even a fraction of those people show up, this will be a disaster. But the event kept growing. News outlets around the world ran segments explaining what Area 51 was and why people were suddenly threatening to sprint toward it. For many viewers, it was their first time hearing the base acknowledged as something real, not just a movie reference. That alone was powerful, a previously non-existent place now at the center of a global joke that might not be a joke. So why did this specific meme catch fire? Partly because Area 51 already lived in everyone's head. Aliens, secret tech, underground labs. It was baked into the cultural operating system. The event didn't have to explain anything. It just tapped the existing belief that, behind those fences, there was something we weren't allowed to see. Partly because of timing. By 2019, people had watched years of leaks about mass surveillance, secret drone programs, classified wars. Trust in institutions had eroded. Many had the nagging sense that major events, from UFO sightings to national security decisions, were decided in rooms they'd never enter. Storm Area 51 was a joke shaped like a question. What if we just didn't accept the wall of secrecy anymore? And partly because the internet loves a dare, the event promised something impossible, turned the most locked down patch of desert on Earth into a giant, chaotic meetup. A digital what if crossed with generations of frustration about being kept outside the circle. As the September date approached, the joke had to collide with geography. Rachel, the tiny town already living on the edge of this legend, suddenly found itself at the center of the world's strangest maybe festival. Locals were worried. The infrastructure was minimal, no big hotels, limited fuel, a handful of businesses. 1 million going on Facebook could translate into gridlock, shortages, or worst case, people getting shot trying to cross the boundary. Local officials, the sheriff's department, the Air Force, and the state of Nevada all had to respond to something that technically didn't exist. They coordinated emergency services, prepared for crowd control, warned people repeatedly that trespassing into the restricted area would be met with force. The Air Force reminded everyone, politely but firmly, that they stand ready to protect America and its assets. And then the date arrived. Instead of a human wave overrunning the fences, a few thousand people actually showed up across the region. Some gathered near Rachel, others in the town of Hiko, where organizers attempted to turn the chaos into a music festival branded alien stock. What emerged was less an invasion and more a carnival. People camped in the desert, wore tinfoil hats, cosplayed as aliens and government agents. They swapped stories, took selfies with the warning signs, and watched the sky at night. A handful of participants did Naruto run past news cameras, fulfilling the meme prophecy. Vendors sold alien merchandise. Bands played. The vibe was less assault on a classified base and more offbeat desert party with an extremely weird theme. Law enforcement reported only a few arrests. A couple of people tried crossing the line and were quickly caught. The base itself remained sealed and distant, a dark horizon beyond floodlights and sensors. No fences were overrun, no hangars revealed. The storm became a footnote, A curiosity, a moment when fantasy and reality briefly touched and then stepped politely apart. But that doesn't mean nothing important happened. For a weekend, the world turned its attention to a remote testing range that officially didn't exist for most of its lifetime and asked, together, what are you really hiding? That question wasn't purely about aliens. It was about decades of black budgets, secret aircraft, officially denied programs that later turned out to be very real. Some of the people in that crowd believed wholeheartedly that non-human craft were stored there. Others just wanted to party under the stars and say they were part of history. Many held both ideas lightly at once, laughing at themselves while still feeling that tug of curiosity that maybe, just maybe, the wildest stories had a grain of truth. The internet gave them a way to organize around that feeling in days, at global scale. Storm Area 51 showed how a meme could become a form of protest, a pressure valve, and a pilgrimage all at once. The humor provided cover. You could say, I'm just here for the memes, while quietly nursing deeper suspicions about hidden technology, unexplained sightings, or decisions made without public input. Irony became a way to approach something people didn't entirely trust but couldn't entirely dismiss. Area 51, in that moment, functioned more as symbol than place. A symbol of everything we suspect might be happening behind closed doors. A symbol of the gap between what we're told and what we imagine. A symbol for people who feel that official explanations about UFOs, about surveillance, about war, tend to arrive late, incomplete, or adjusted only when leaks make denial impossible. The storm ended with dust, music, and internet jokes, but the deeper tension remained. Humans still saw strange lights over deserts and oceans. Military pilots still reported encounters with objects that didn't behave like known aircraft. Government agencies still classified mountains of data under layers of acronyms and redactions. And millions of people, scrolling on their phones late at night, still wondered how much of the unbelievable might be quietly true. Storm Area 51 didn't crack open a hangar door. It did something subtler. It proved that a site born in the secrecy of the 1950s still has the power, in the age of memes and live streams, to draw people out of their houses and into the desert in search of answers. It showed that under the sarcasm and cosplay, there is a genuine, widespread hunger to see behind the curtain, even if what's back there turns out to be advanced but human-built aircraft, or something stranger that official channels have only begun to hint at. And after the tents were packed up, and the last Naruto runner went home, the fences stayed up. The warning signs stayed in place. The base went on testing things we're not allowed to see. Which raises the next question: after all the revelations, rumors, and desert parties, what, if anything, might still be waiting out there in the dark beyond Groom Lake? If we strip away the memes and the merch for a second and just look at the pattern, one thing is almost certain: Area 51 is still doing exactly what it was built to do. Test things that fly long before the rest of us are supposed to know they exist. For decades, every time the public finally learned what had been going on there, it was already history. The U-2, the A-12, the early stealth prototypes. By the time they got official names and glossy museum plaques, they were already being replaced by something newer, stranger, faster. There's no reason to think that process stopped. Today, the cutting edge isn't just a single silver airplane that goes higher or faster. It's an ecosystem. Networks of drones, hypersonic gliders, stealthy aircraft that talk to each other, swarms that move like flocks of birds but think like a coordinated weapon. If you were the Pentagon and you wanted to test that kind of thing away from phone cameras and commercial satellites, you'd still need a place like Groom Lake. Some observers think the skies over Area 51 are now dominated by drones. Not the buzzing quadcopters you buy online, but long-range, high-altitude platforms that stay up for days or weeks. Stealthy UAVs that can slip into contested airspace without a pilot on board. Exotic shapes that don't look like traditional airplanes at all. Wing-body hybrids, flying wings with no tail, designs that, if you saw them against the stars, might absolutely register in your brain as not from here. There are credible hints of that. Budget lines for penetrating ISR platforms, reports of large, unacknowledged aircraft operating out of the Nevada test and training range. Occasional grainy photos of odd triangular silhouettes refueling from tankers. None of them stamped with neat labels, all of them consistent with prototypes cycling through a secret test pipeline. Then there's hypersonics, weapons and vehicles that fly at 5, 6, 7 times the speed of sound. Fast enough to outrun most defenses, but insanely hard to control and cool. They generate shockwaves, plasma, strange signatures on radar and infrared. Test flights go wrong. Pieces come down where they're not supposed to. If you're going to push that envelope, you want vast, controlled airspace and a culture that already knows how to hide accidents. The kind of place where if something streaks across the sky and disintegrates in a way no one can immediately explain, the default answer can still be weather balloon, training exercise, or nothing at all. Electronic warfare is quieter, but just as important. Modern conflict is as much about who can see and talk as who can shoot. Jamming radar, spoofing GPS, making an aircraft look like it's somewhere else, or not there at all. Creating false targets on a screen so a pilot or missile chases a ghost. Those systems have to be tested against real sensors, in real air, with real complexity. You'd want to blast strange signals into the sky where civilian airliners aren't supposed to be. You'd want to blind and confuse radars that aren't listed on any public chart. You'd want to know, down to the second, what happens when you turn the electronics battlefield up to 10. Again, that's exactly the kind of work that fits a highly restricted test range. And of course, stealth isn't done. What we call stealth today, F-22s, F-35s, B-2s, that's stealth 1.0 and 2.0. There are entire fields of research aimed at the next step. Aircraft that can change shape in flight, surfaces that absorb not just radar but specific frequencies on demand, active camouflage that shifts color and brightness, even designs that trade invisibility for looking like something else on sensors. A bomber that presents itself on radar as a small civilian jet. A drone that looks like an atmospheric anomaly. A swarm that appears to be a single object until it doesn't. That kind of technology, if it works, would make the line between advanced military craft and unidentified aerial phenomenon blurrier than ever. Which brings us back to the more extraordinary ideas. For some people, Area 51 isn't just where we test our best inventions. It's where we store someone else's. Recovered craft from crash sites. Non-human technology reverse engineered in underground labs. Materials or propulsion systems that don't fit neatly into known physics. These claims range from vague stories told decades after the fact, to more recent sworn testimony in government hearings, to classified programs whose names surface without clear explanations. We don't have declassified documents that say, yes, we have an intact non-human vehicle parked in Hangar 18. But we also have a long track record of the government denying things, sometimes for decades that later turned out to be absolutely real. Project Blue Book dismissed many UFO reports as misidentifications or hoaxes, while U-2s and other classified aircraft were literally causing some of those sightings. Pilots were seeing something real. The explanation was misdirected, not entirely made up. It's not impossible to imagine a similar pattern at a higher level. Maybe some of the unidentified anomalous phenomena described by military personnel are black projects out of places like Groom Lake, wrapped in layers of classification so deep that even seasoned insiders don't know what they're looking at. Maybe, in a smaller subset of cases, they are genuinely unknowns, objects or behaviors we don't have a prosaic file for yet. And maybe, in the wildest version, there really is a hangar somewhere on that vast test range with technology that did not originate in any program we can trace through budgets and contractor lists. The problem is all three possibilities could look the same from the outside. Secrecy, myth, and real classified programs overlap until it's almost impossible to tell which is which. A strange light in the sky might be a next-gen drone, an unexplained phenomenon, or a story embellished over beers. The public evidence doesn't always let you sort them cleanly. Area 51 sits exactly at that crossroads. Some of its mysteries almost certainly have ordinary answers, new airplanes, new weapons, trials that will one day show up in documentaries with retired engineers explaining how they pulled it off. Other questions resist being filed away so neatly. Why do some sightings describe performance beyond what even cutting-edge physics seems to allow? Why are significant portions of UFO-related programs still redacted in documents released in this century, long after the Cold War ended? Why do seasoned pilots and radar operators, people trained to filter out noise, continue to report encounters that don't match any disclosed platform? It's possible that Area 51 is simply the most convenient projection screen for all of this. A real place, known to be secret, surrounded by mountains and motion sensors, where our fears and hopes about hidden technology can land. It's also possible that behind those fences, both stories are playing out at once. On one runway, engineers test very human machines, built by very human hands, for very human wars. In another, more secure corner, something older, stranger, or not entirely ours is studied in pieces and fragments, its lessons slowly absorbed into designs we can't yet recognize. Or maybe the truth lies in layers we haven't imagined, an interplay of homegrown innovation, misdirection, and rare encounters with the genuinely unknown. For now, the desert keeps its own counsel. We can map the runways from orbit and trace budget lines through Pentagon documents. We can listen to declassified histories and late-night testimonies. We can stand on the dirt near Rachel, stare at a dark horizon, and watch for lights that move in ways they're not supposed to. But what is still really there, in the hangars and underground spaces beyond Groom Lake, remains unresolved, balanced between conventional explanations and possibilities that don't fit comfortably in any file folder, waiting for a future where a few more doors quietly or suddenly open. So we end up where we began, with a dry lake bed in Nevada that was once just another empty patch of desert and is now a global synonym for "you're not allowed to know." In a single lifetime, Groom Lake went from a scratched-out runway for a spy plane no one could talk about, to the center of a mythology that blends flight test programs, budget line items, late-night radio, congressional hearings, and stories about things that might not be from here at all. We know some of it now. We know about the U-2 and the A-12 and the Blackbird. We know how their contrails and radar signatures turned into UFO reports. We know about Have Blue, the F-117, the first stealth shapes that bent radar instead of brute forcing through it. We know that engineers and pilots risked their lives there, that accidents happened, that families were left with questions they couldn't get answered. We also know there are credible unknowns, military encounters logged in official channels that don't match any public aircraft, programs that show up in redacted memos with names but no descriptions, testimony under oath that hints at materials and craft which don't fit in the standard inventory list. None of that proves the most extraordinary claims. It also doesn't erase them. Between those two poles, what's documented and what's still only whispered, sits everything else. Misidentifications, hoaxes, misremembered events, but also possibly genuine phenomena that don't have a neat label yet. That mixture is why Area 51 doesn't fade. Every generation rediscovers it. First as a Cold War rumor, then as a tabloid headline, then as an internet meme, then as a subject for serious hearings. Each time, the facts get a little clearer. Each time, new questions slide into the gaps that remain. Some truths have surfaced. We can read the declassified manuals, hear the old pilots talk, stand next to retired aircraft in museums and know, concretely, that yes, those once lived in the shadows of that valley. Other truths, if they exist, are quieter. Maybe they're locked in vaults under the hangars. Maybe they're buried in budget documents we don't yet know how to interpret. Maybe they're not in any human archive at all, written only in the memory of the land and the people who worked there and never spoke. So the story remains unfinished. A real secret base in a real desert, ringed by cameras and sensors, carrying decades of confirmed history and a horizon of possibilities we can only sketch in the dark. The runway lights go on and off. Test flights launch and land. Tourists park on the dirt and watch the sky. And above it all, the desert keeps its silence. For now, it's content to hold what it knows: cold metal, lost nights, quiet breakthroughs, and whatever else may be resting just out of view, until the day more of it finally steps out of the shadows and the line between legend and history shifts once again.